Hi guys, welcome to listen Harry Potter fanfics. I thought that Harry Potter fanfics would be good content in my channel, even if it's in English, but almost all my content is in Finnish. But Harry Potter is now 20 years old, so I thought that maybe I should try to start new thing in my channel. So my first story about Harry Potter fanfic is called Your Hand in Mine, which is written by V. Arago. Let's hear out what we have. Shall we begin? Okay. She was holding his hand. Or maybe he was holding hers. Either way, their fingers were intertwined, palms pressed each against each other. Harry had no idea why he only just noticed it, but he looked down and all of a sudden he was just aware. It wasn't as if it was the first time him and Hermione had done such a thing, holding hands. Now that he talked about it, they did it quite often actually. When had that started? It was a little odd. How it didn't seem odd at all. How normal it felt to be sitting there with her hand in his. Harry was pretty sure that if he was holding anyone else's hand, it wouldn't feel nearly as natural or normal. Which then begged the question why? Why did it feel so normal to be holding Hermione's hand? Why was it something that happened so naturally he hadn't even noticed it was happening until he looked down and saw it for himself? He squeezed her hand a bit, pondering the feeling of Hermione's skin against his. Was it that her hand was softer than almost others, and was that more comfortable to hold? Hmm. Hermione squeezed back just slightly, though she didn't turn to look at him. Harry thought that while yes, her hand was soft and did feel very nice in his, that there wasn't exactly anything special about the way Hermione's hands felt in particular. He's held Ron's hand once or twice, and his hands had been nice and tender too. He was sure holding Ron's hand would have been just as pleasant as holding Hermione's. They didn't, though. Hold hands, that was. Harry's hands have never once sought out Ron's concisely, unconsciously. That was the word. How hard was that? But even so, even on purpose, it was rare. Still curious, Harry flipped their hands over so that Hermione's was on top. He carefully looked over her fingers, wondering if there was some sort of secret to them. They were pretty fingers, that he knew. Perhaps not in a traditional sense, as they weren't exactly slender or smooth, like Fleur's, or maybe Ginny's. Hermione's nails were cut short, and there was a bit more meat on her fingers even compared to Harry's own. He picked up on a few small scars here and there too. She told him about them once, Unsurprisingly, they were mostly minor book-related injuries. They were neat fingers, practical fingers. Harry actually quite liked them. There was something very distinctly Hermione about them, something personal about them, like he'd always be able to recognize them no matter the time or place. Despite the fact that she had undoubtedly pretty hands, he knew that wasn't a reason he held her hand so often. Most of the time he seemed to be doing it completely subconsciously, concisely. Damn, this is a difficult word. Concise, concis, subconscious, concise, consciously. Uh, Never mind. Without looking, so it definitely didn't have anything to do with the way they looked. Harry was tempted to lift up their hands and take a sniff, but considering the fact that they weren't alone and everyone would probably think he was mad if he tried, he eventually decided against it. He was pretty confident he already knew that they'd smell like anyway, parchment and ink mostly, sometimes even a bit like Cruikshank's fur. If he was having one of those clingy days and Hermione felt like indulging him, he knew she'd also taken to using perfume recently, something like a subtle and refreshing scent, so sometimes her whole person smelled like it. It was a bit like it if toothpaste were perfume, nice and easy on the nose, not overwhelming at all. It wasn't at all like of the perfume bottles he'd once seen Lavender carrying around, which had things like fancy foreign vanilla and dozens of flowers he'd never heard of printed on the label. That didn't feel quite like the right answer either. If he wasn't looking at her hands before reaching out for them, he certainly wasn't smelling them either. Unable to puzzle it out, and finally coming to terms with the fact that he simply couldn't figure it out on his own, he raised his head, about to ask Hermione what she thought about it. Hermione wasn't looking at him, though she was laughing at something that Ron had just said, and her cheeks were a bit pink. Harry's words got stuck in his throat. This, he was sure, was also something he's seen 1,000 times. Hermione's laughter was a sound that he was intimately familiar with, just as he was familiar with the sound of Ron's snores. But he was noticing things today in a way he had never done before, and today Hermione looked kind of beautiful as she laughed, which was strange because she always also looked exactly the same as she always did, which meant, oh, Harry looked back down to their interlocked fingers. No wonder. He felt a bit silly thinking about it now. The answer had always been so obvious. Then he froze for a second, his hand unconsciously concisely clenching tighter around Hermione's. Hermione was brilliant, had always been brilliant. She was always also much smarter than him. Did she already figure it out? Had she known this whole time? Was she waiting for him, or was she waiting to let him down? Suddenly filled with the type of panic that he hasn't experienced since Joe, Harry was seriously pondering simply running out the door, but Hermione must have sensed his sudden shift in mood, for she tugged on his hand, almost yanking his focus back onto her. "Harry!" She was smiling, but her eyes looked a bit wide, like she was concerned about him, but didn't want to worry anybody else. He tried smiling back at her. It didn't work. She only narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously, in the way that he knew meant she'd be prying out whatever was troubling him the minute they were alone. "I'm fine," he said, and surprisingly that didn't go over too well either. Rather than let Hermione stare all-knowingly at him anymore, Harry simply looked away and shoved a forkful of mash into his mouth instead, pretending he was now occupied with eating. It took a second, but eventually Hermione did turn away and went back to discussing something with Bill from across the table. Relaxing just a touch, Harry stole a few covert glances at Hermione while her attentions were focused elsewhere. She stopped talking every once in a while to nibble on her bread roll, but otherwise didn't touch the rest of her food. Harry noticed the seemingly untouched bit of chicken on her plate, and the knife on the right side of her plate near him. He stood staring at the knife in disbelief before his eyes eventually made their way back to their joined hands yet again. The pieces were all there, and Harry could make sense of them all individually, but when he put them back together it made his head spin. Hermione didn't eat the roast chicken on her plate because she couldn't use her knife. She couldn't use her knife because couldn't use her right hand. She couldn't use her right hand because her right hand was in Harry's left. The question was, once again, why? Why was Hermione not eating her chicken? Why was Hermione still holding Harry's hand if she knew she needed to eat it? He knew what he wanted the answer to be. Hermione turned to him again as if feeling his heavy gaze on her. Harry blinked and then smiled slowly, hoping she didn't notice how sweaty his palms just became. "You're acting a bit strange tonight. Is something going on?" she asked. Harry struggled to find a convincing response. "We're still holding hands, did you know?" In the end he settled for a sharp left turn instead, though he felt desperately like taking the words back even as they came out of his mouth. Hermione's jaw dropped just a bit before she looked down as if to confirm for herself that he was telling the truth. When she looked back at him a moment later her cheeks seemed to go from pink to red. And yet she didn't remove her hand from his. Harry sucked in a sharp breath. "I didn't notice," she replied eventually, after a long, long silence. "Do you want me to let go?" His palms were getting sweatier by the minute, and his heart was beginning to race uncomfortably. He felt warm and a bit ill, but in a good way, that made the rest of the world feel far away. No, I don't. Endnotes. It's not a hand fetish. He's just in love with her, I swear. And this is the end of the story, which was called Your Hand in Mine by Virago. Thank you very much.